Welcome back, everyone. Today is the first video in yet another new playlist, because what's a hobby collector who isn't collecting the hobbies? Specifically, we're about to look at one of my IFR training flights. It's actually one of my first view-restricted approaches back into Chicago, and it's one that early on highlighted what it means to fall behind the airplane. But before we break that down, let's talk about my flying history on the way back down to Chicago from Whitman Regional in Oshkosh. My flying journey began like quite a few others. My first childhood computer was in 1992, and only a few weeks later my first flight simulator arrived, which was a very bootleg version of Flight Sim 3.0 with its glorious views of downtown Chicago. I obsessed over every new version that dropped, more than once working jobs just to build or upgrade a computer that could run the latest version. Now this carried on all the way until COVID hit in 2020, and I was locked down with a brand new computer in Flight Sim 2020, complete with plastic yokes and that brand new hardware to eke out 30 frames per second. Then on one of my marathon sessions during this time, my amazing wife was rolling her eyes even harder than usual and reminded me that I'm a working professional engineer and should just use some of my discretionary funds to learn to fly for real. Well, I didn't need to hear that twice and bought my discovery flight about 5 minutes later. To say this adventure consumed me would be an understatement that really cannot be adequately expressed. I lost sleep to study it. I skimped on work to get in another lesson. I may have even lied to a few people about what time I would be making it home for dinner just to practice one more landing. And after 4 months, I was able to schedule my check ride. I remember distinctly when the examiner looked at my logbook and saw only 41 flat hours logged. In all reality, with the average pilot completing their check ride closer to 70 or 80 hours, his incredulous brow furrow was justified. But 4 hours later, I had adequately demonstrated what it means to commit yourself to a goal. Now, if we fast forward from that 41-hour private pilot to this IFR training, I have notched just about 100 hours of total experience, and roughly 40 of those have been VFR in this very plane we're looking at now. It's a 2005 Columbia 400, and it's an airplane that does its approaches near the maximum cruising speed of those high-wing trainers I was using for my initial pilot certificate, which is to say quite a bit more performance. It's not inherently a comment to gloat about anything, but it does play a fact into what we're about to see. Throughout my private training, the focus was to look outside, to practice the maneuvers that will keep you proficient in handling an aircraft in mostly ideal weather. The goal is to build your competency as hiccups occur and you're able to expand your envelope of being ahead of the airplane. Then I committed myself to transitioning into IFR training and referencing only instruments during flight. I thought I would excel at this. I'd get to treat it like a video game, right? Just understand the physics from the private pilot training and get that feel of the plane from good weather, and then rigorously consume that plethora of data from the instruments to fly against. Should be an easy engineering task, right? Well, no. As it turns out, when you add a view-limiting device like the foggles I'm wearing, and are trying to acclimate to a completely different reference point, you're really changing a lot of variables all at once. Now let's get back to this particular flight, which started out feeling pretty good. We left Oshkosh, picked up flight following so I could practice the procedural handoffs and get more comfortable on the radios, and we were prepared to ask for the RNAV 16 back into Chicago Executive. All in all, pretty typical flight, and one we had briefed prior to the departure. There is one thing that hadn't sunk into my head at the time of this flight, and that's just how much higher performance this plane is than a normal trainer. And we all have this image of ourselves driving high-powered sports cars around a track as if we're as good as a professional race car driver. This feeling of confidence exists in almost every pilot I've ever met. On some level, it plays into what keeps us safe. But on another level, it can also set us up for trouble. So when we heard Chicago Approach ask us,
1 Bravo Golf, and what's your indicated ground speed?
And we replied with,
185 right now, 1 Bravo Golf.
I got that dopamine hit of being slotted in with the big boys and the jets, especially when ATC then came back with,
1 Bravo Golf and Roger, maintain no 180 knots or greater for the time being. You're going to be number 1 in the sequence.
If I'm being truthful, I should have replied at that time, unable. The fact is, I was way too early in my flying experience to properly perform this approach at 120 knots, let alone keeping my speed 50% above that. Because we were already almost straight into 1.6 on the RNAV, this didn't get as bad as it could have been. But I'm already behind the airplane. I've given up my authority to maintain a speed I'm competent at handling, which means I've gone outside of what has become my normal pitch and power settings over the past 40 hours in this plane that I would use to descend and land. Now, I'm very fortunate to have my CFI with me, and not just a safety pilot while I'm practicing under the hood. We'll watch this play out, and even a non-pilot will see just how low I got, how my instructor was stepping in to remind me of my speed and my altitude, to stick to my navigation aids, pointing out my failures to maintain my awareness of the configuration of the plane. As I said a moment ago, we're about to watch this play out in real time from the point of being cleared for the practice approach. Now, for reference, the Haigu waypoint is 11.4 nautical miles from the runway threshold. If I were to maintain a consistent 180 knots, this is just over 3.5 minutes to manage my lateral tracking, my vertical descent, my speed, configuring the flaps, communicating with the tower, making sure I'm not busting altitudes, and, oh yeah, in theory, I can't see what I'm doing outside the windows. It's also legal for these small planes to do all of this with just one pilot. And so even though this is early in my training, and it's just practice, you can hear my frustration in my own performance because of the implications it has for when I have to do this for real. Now let's watch it play out.
1 Bravo Golf, 2 miles from Haigu, cross start correction, maintain VFR. Practice approach approved, straight in.
Practice approach approved, straight in, 1 Bravo Golf. Do we have a speed restriction?
1 Bravo Golf, for now maintain 180 knots or greater. I'll have a slower inbound. You're just going to be number 1 at 5.
Roger that. Number 1 will maintain 180, 1 Bravo Golf. I think we just crossed Haigu, didn't we? We did. All right, let's descend down to 2,300. Means my speed goes up even more. All right, 2,300. Yep, and let's get over to the on course.
And best forward speed on final, but it's speed your discretion. Contact executive tower 119.9.
All right, we'll contact tower speed at our discretion. Thank you. Have a good one. Tower's up. Executive towers, Columbia 371 Bravo Golf, 2.5 from Pammy.
Columbia 371 Bravo Golf, executive tower number 2, following a Cessna on a 1.5 mile final, runway 16, clear to land, stay parking.
Area 2, clear to land, 16, 1 Bravo Golf. All right, speed at our discretion, so we can deploy those speed brakes.
Mike, just extend the upwind a half mile.
All right, extend the up 1.5 miles, 6 Mike.
Says 59 Golf, continue following the Cessna there on the upwind.
Watch your speed.
We'll continue upwind wind.
I mean, altitude.
9 Golf.
Yep. Pammy, 1320. Or 2300 until Pammy, so we're quite low. Yep.
Target unit, Second City 585, RNAV 16.
Second City 585, tower, advise you have information Foxtrot, number 3, following a Columbia 4-mile final, runway 16, clear to land.
We're going to get rid of your speed brakes for a second, so we can get back up.
Yeah, I was definitely very focused on slowing down there.
All right, we're past Pammy, and we can drop down to 1320.
Pammy 1320, so.
Yep. Right here?
Yep, I got it.
Okay. Okay, level up. Start bringing ahead. There you go, good. Good. Way to adjust that course. Get back up.
You take my speed brakes off? You did. First notch of flaps.
Watch that altitude. Alright, you broke up.
At this point, I'm at minimums for this approach about a mile earlier than I should be. And there are airports where I could conceivably be in a position where this would be me crashing into a tower or hitting terrain. Now, when I compare this to the typical approach speeds for this plane of 110 to 120 knots, I would have had more than 2.5 additional minutes to slow down, configure, and approach more properly. In realizing that, it becomes a very humbling moment for me. One where I'm sort of actively realizing that I'm not that professional race car driver I am in my head. I'm still a student. Yes, I'm a certificated pilot, but I'm a student to the experiences of growing my skills. I'm also very fortunate to have had this experience early in my training, and particularly to have had this moment with an instructor that I trust. Now, I've since gone on to show an ACS level of proficiency and earned my official instrument flying privileges, but I look back at this moment somewhat regularly to remind myself that it's okay to be humbled periodically. But try to do your humbling in an environment where you can learn from it, instead of having to learn any of this for the first time in a real-life situation, especially when it comes to airplanes. But let's not end this on too much of a down note. Stay tuned to this playlist and subscribe to the channel, as I'll occasionally be adding more of my training, perhaps some more of my interesting trips, and maybe even a detailed walk around of the plane, and my daydreams of future upgrades.